and jump in. Everyone should have the agenda in the calendar invite, but I will chat it out for you. Hopefully that works. And so what we wanted to talk about today was the task force that the state board unanimously approved, frame the purpose, begin thinking about what questions we would work to answer, what are our goals, align on a timeline, and about that, like what might be our public engagement for this task force, advertising it to the public, getting external folk on the task force, and discussing roles and responsibilities, what roles each of us will want to play. For a quick frame, and then we can jump right in. And I know we only have an hour, so I'm hoping that this hour can be super productive. The gist of it is, we know that there's a lot of discussion around reopening schools. When we first proposed this task force and approved it, DC was in a much different place than we are today. I imagine in another month or two, DC will be in a completely different place. And so there are so many questions around what schooling will look like later this spring, this summer, this fall. The purpose of this task force is for us to ideally be a value add, to elevate best practices, and to support the city, schools, as well as officials with information around what schools need and are doing to reopen schools. With that, we don't have a focus. It's pretty general and vague as of now. In every meeting that Emily and I have had with officials, hey Fraser, from OSSI to the chancellor to Mendelson, et cetera, we've been asking the question, what would be helpful for us to focus on through this task force? And I will just run through some of the things that we've heard. And I know, Serena, you've been in some of those meetings, and Emily, I don't know if she's there, but feel free to chime in. From Mendelson, he said there are things, but I don't recall him naming something in particular. There were three areas that he probed our sister offices on, as well as the state board. One was around special education. He really delved deeply there. Another was around teacher retention. And then the third was he was interested in our ad hoc committee around board governance. I don't think that relates to this work, though. When we talked to the chancellor, when we talked to OSSI, their response was, it would be helpful to elevate what's working. Instead of naming problems, how do we name what is working, what people are doing that's having success? And so that was their entry point. They also said they would be happy to collaborate with us on this task force. When we met with the chancellor, his response was similar to OSSI's, but his was around what support schools need in order to hit the ground running in the fall. And everyone's acknowledging that we don't quite know what the fall is going to be. So I don't know if that is super helpful, but just giving you that context. Serena, is there anything you would add from the conversations we've had together with district folk around things you've heard?
And I would say overall that what the points that you captured are sort of accurate. I'm not really sure, like similar to what you said about the governance piece, I'm not really sure that like how, particularly Mendelson, because that's the only conversation that I was a part of, like I'm not really sure how much of what he was asking pertained to reopening, or if he was really just kind of looking for insights into like some of the issues that we were seeing, and that we were highlighting things like special education as one of those issues. It does seem like that, I mean, the Mendelson team was pretty clear that they're sort of they have moved forward with sort of their own community engagement, and like hearing from the community about what the community feels like it needs. And some of the people who have attended those meetings were also school administrators, and I'm not sure, like, you know, the teacher representation. And there was, so to that end, it sounds like they've kind of like hit the ground running, and like they will be sort of developing their own plan. I've also heard that Paul Kine and out of the DME, like that they've sort of developed a plan, or or either have already developed a plan or are in the process of mapping out their plan to develop a plan. I'm not really sure which, but it does seem like from a lot of the conversations that I've had that people are sort of like underway in mapping out something. And to the piece of like the elevating sort of both what's working well and elevating the other plans that are coming out or that will be coming out. I think that can be a part of this conversation too, right? Like, is it that you want that this task force wants to focus on sort of developing its own thing, or is it that you want to sort of be ready for once Mendelssohn's team puts out their plan to be able to share that with the public and have community conversation around that and like identify gaps, right? Like that sort of thing. I feel like I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop talking. Yeah.
No, I think that was a great point. I'm Emily, I would love if there's something you heard from officials we've met with that might inform where we focus, and then we're going to go to everybody and just say, what are areas that you would put on the table that we as a task force should explore? Serena, to your latest point, that 6-point plan the DME offered, I'm going to find it and then chat it because that could serve as a starting point for us. Emily, anything you would add there?
I mean, what really stood out to me when the chancellor was at our meeting was that the plan is to go back as normal. And they outlined, I think, I'm not sure if he talked about this in our meeting, but when we met with him, he talked about like the 3 ways that they plan to support students. And I can find that, but it was like, one is just, universal, everybody gets this support, but then they're going to have like targeted small groupings and then the tutoring piece as well. So that was kind of the extent of what I heard in terms of planning. I guess, I heard you when you were saying like they would find it useful if we highlight things that are working. And I think that's important, but I also think that we can make recommendations where we see the need for them, where we see the need for something more robust. And I guess that's one place where I would say it struck me as there needs to be something a little more robust here, and it would be great if we can go back to normal, but what if we can't? Shouldn't we have some contingency plans there? What are they? So those are my thoughts.
Okay, cool, appreciate it. Fraser, Alistair, and really anybody, what are things that are top of mind for you that may serve as an essential question for us to try to answer through this task force?
I don't know what your direction is as far as a task force. I'm totally against going back to normal. I think that anybody that thinks that we want to go back to the DC public school system that was in existence in February of 2020 that's not what I ran on. That's not what I observed for 100 years in the system. I think that, I think that right now the system, because you were talking about the chancellor and the OSSI and the deputy mayor, it's not them, it's the mayor. And what they want is to go back to what it used to be like so that they don't have to do anything. And I don't know I don't want to be on a task force that's trying to get back to what it used to be like. So you can find somebody else to be on that task force. Because that's not what I'm not testifying. I'm testifying tomorrow, and it's completely against that.
So what is the question there? I think many would agree with you that we know what was happening before wasn't working. So what then would we focus on as trying to get to this new normal?
Who are we talking to?
That's what we're figuring out, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so Fraser, I think we share your pieces of your critique. It's when I think about how this group can be constructive right now, I think a lot about sort of what the educators and families in my ward have told me, at least, right? And I'll just share some of that, because I think those are some things I would be really interested in solving for in the immediate term with this task force. So this clarity piece, right? I mean, people are so sick of getting the rug pulled out from under them, having decisions made the day before for what happens the next day. It's super abstract, right? But when I talk with folks, that's kind of the number one thing, right? Can you give us some time to plan, right? We think you're telling us what's going to happen in the fall. Trust is being lost if you're going to say schools are going to reopen it fully in person in the fall, and then if the day before it changes, I think people are going to be really, really upset. So how do we?
They're not going to be any more upset, Alistair, than they are now. You know that's her MO. That's how it's going to be. They're not looking for change. They're looking to try to make it through this school year. If you look at this document, which is the grading policy for the 2019, 2020, 21 school year, it's unbelievable. I wouldn't even want my children to be under the grading policy where they wouldn't have to do any work and they can't get lower than a 50. And they don't have to they get credit for taking 6 lessons the second semester if they fail.
Fraser, I mean, there's 2 ways to go about that, right? One is we attempt to try to answer those questions, get clarity, get more planning done. The other is what? Tell them to leave the system?
No, I think we need to, if we're going to be a task force on the actual reopening of schools, and if the definition of reopening schools is all schools are open and all students are back in the school.
Why is that the definition of reopening schools?
I'm sorry?
Why is that the definition?
Well, are we reopened now? They think we're reopened. There's 40 kids at Cardozo. I mean, how many, like School Out Walls and Banneker and those kinds of, what does reopening mean?
Yeah, I guess that's something we define, right? Because another big piece is, I'd say almost every principal I've spoken to in my ward wants to see a centralized virtual school, right? Rather than have each of the schools be responsible for basically managing 2 schools, an in-person one and a virtual one. I've heard that from multiple principals saying, look at so many other cities and states have just one centralized virtual system. And then everyone else is just handling in person. I've been trying to dig into this. I don't have a good answer yet. Maybe you all have some better context for it, but why haven't we had that this whole time? Like Tulsa has had that since last March, from my understanding. And it would, at least for the educators, make so much less work. And then for the fall, be able to offer if people want to opt out, it's a very easy way to opt out of, going back to in-person if you have an in-person centralized way to do it. Right? So those are the kinds of things that are on my mind's eye.
It's logical. You're being logical, Alistair. Okay? That's the problem. I'm dead serious. If it's logical, they ain't doing it at all. That's what the whole problem is. Why don't you try this? Why don't you try? They don't want to try anything. They don't have a plan. Tutoring is a great idea. There's no plan. Have you seen any tutoring group? Have you seen any group that's been asked to be tutors for people? Have they advertised anything to be tutors? Anything like that? Nothing.
We agree that there are many issues. I think to this question around what our task force and therefore what we can do to be a value add, something that is personally top of mind for me is around students with disabilities that we know are not receiving services, we know are not fully engaged in all respects in our schools, whether virtual or in person or hybrid. And I've thrown out this idea of doing an audit, and I don't know what that looks like via task force, but somehow, like, how can we potentially take an inventory of where our students with special needs are, the services that they are due, the services that they are receiving, and make recommendations for what needs to happen between now and school reopening, whenever that may be.
That is a conversation to have with Aussie too, Zach, just FYI. Maybe
it's on
not.
our agenda.
That is? Okay.
Yeah. And Serena, if you recall, this question is what I kind of threw to you and Dan. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't like in the deep end thinking about that. And I know Ossie's formal response is, it's the law. Our guidance has not changed, but we know in reality, students are not receiving their services. And that's not to shame and blame. That's just understanding where we are.
But
so
to
I think it would be great if somehow our task force could elevate the needs of students with disabilities.
I like that. I like that. I think I want to be thoughtful about then what our
is this one or two
task force is called, and how we think about sort of the time. Everything is timely and urgent, right? But I think especially because we're thinking about this is a particularly time-bound, hopefully, right, task force. I think to limit it to just serving the needs of a certain segment of students, it also limits our, if we're to do a survey of all parents and add a question in there about special needs and whether or not they're being met, that makes sense to me. I think we should be talking with all families, though.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Sorry. Can I just say a couple of things that have come up here listening to all of you? One is that I agree with Fraser, and I guess I want to clarify that when I say it would be great if we can go back to normal, all I mean is if we don't have to deal with COVID anymore as a major factor, right? So my understanding when they say that is like everybody can go back in person without worrying about being infected. So that's all I mean. But I really hope that what this task force takes on is making recommendations for ways that we can address the issues that we know existed before COVID to some extent, to both Fraser's point, and I think, Serena, you made this point in our conversation with Mendo, that, the issues with meeting the needs of kids with special needs predates COVID, right? Like their needs were not being met. And it's, of course, everything's exacerbated right now. But I wonder if, just taking it to sort of a higher level, we can talk more about what are creative solutions to, first of all, if we can't all go back in person safely. And secondly, even if we can, what are the areas where we needed attention anyway, and we know those are going to be extra bad? Like we know those are going to be areas of just dire need. So
if we're doing a task force on reopening and there's this pie in the sky idea that it's August of 2021, then we need to focus on what are they doing now to get students to be smarter in the next 4 months.
Smart.
Because I don't think they have a plan for anything. I think they're just waiting until the end of the school year, and then they're going to plan for what they're going to do in summer school. And then it's just like last summer, they had such a perfect time during the summer of 2020 to really revolutionize the idea of what students needed to do, knowing that they were going to have most of the students on computers, at least at the beginning of the year. But they haven't done anything about it. The kids don't have a lot of students still haven't been online. A lot of students don't have access to working computers. They're sitting there with their siblings in the room. The parents are either there or they're not. It's not normal. Normal now is not even
hey,
education.
you guys, can I just, Serena actually wanted to talk, and I just want to pull her in.
Thank you. I kind of want to summarize a lot of what I've heard, and it feels like the energy of the group is really moving away from elevating necessarily what's working well, but really focused on identifying the problems and problems that existed sort of pre-COVID and that have, gotten exacerbated during COVID, and troubleshooting for those in advance of the fall, but also problem identification and also creative recommendations, but also like this definition of what it means to reopen. And I know Alistair and Fraser, like you had some thoughts about that, and for you, Fraser, especially some really strong thoughts about that. And I want to be clear that while we in this conversation may be trying to identify what or define what reopening is, like the city's leaders, I think, have made clear that what they see as reopening is full-time in-person instruction for the vast majority of students. So I'm putting that out there in terms of trying to like weave our conversation to potentially fit that narrative, or in being very intentional about deviating from that narrative. The last piece that I wanted to say is around the virtual instruction piece. Alistair, you gave the example of other jurisdictions who have one central for that whole jurisdiction. I think it came up in conversation with in public sort of town halls with the chancellor, is that there is a conversation around what virtual instruction might look like in the fall, and particularly for students, and not just in the fall, I will say indefinitely, because there have been some students and some populations of students who really liked this virtual model, and it's working well for them, and they don't want to go back to the classroom. So it's in conversation. It's not off the table, but no one knows exactly what that's going to look like yet. And actually, sort of not lastly, so I do want to get to Emily's point around like what the chancellor described as sort of the interventionist approach. The RTI is what I talk about this all the time. RTI is that 3-tier, right? You've got most of your students in your gen ed, the students who are not getting gen ed curriculum, they need that double dose. They're the tier 3 or tier 2, and then students who need even more intervention will be in your tier 3. Emily, you're right? We already have RTI in DCPS. I do know that in the summer, DCPS is actually releasing a new sort of RTI/MTSS plan, which is my understanding they have been working on prior to distance learning, but may be heavily impacted and may actually address some of the recovery needs within that plan. But again, like I haven't seen it. I just know it's coming out this summer. I think like where you're talking about sort of populations that had already been underserved and needing to do more. I think some of the questions that I have around that is, well, we understand like that things like RTI, MTSS are already going to be in place when kids go back to school, and in theory are already in place now. What I don't quite have clarity on is how is the additional funding that is going to our Title I schools, how is that going to be used? So does that mean then that their classes are going to be smaller and that they're going to have an increased student teacher ratio? Right? Because part of the problem that we see in our Title I schools is a lot of times the vast majority of students in that classroom are are performing on that tier 3 level. Yep. Right. So that's what we see. We see the inverted RTI triangle. So what are we going to do to address that? Again, to Emily's point, in a more substantive manner. And I do also just want to take the minute to clarify that, like, for my role on the task force is I really just wanted to be a part of this conversation, because I've been talking to other people who had ideas for how my office can participate sort of as a neutral and like mostly in like facilitating conversation. And so I'm really an ex aficionado in terms of my membership in this. Like and I really just wanted to be a part of the conversation to see what you all come up with, to see if there is sort of a natural fit for my office or not. So the end.
Go for it, Alistair.
Serena, I wish you were part of every meeting that I was, I was on. It's really helpful to have you kind of put all the puzzle pieces together. I like how your brain works. Um, I've got to jump in a bit, and I just wanted to a little early today, so I wanted to just kind of see if something like this would make sense for us as a process. So um, I think, you know, there's so many questions that people don't feel like they're getting answers to, families, educators, administrators. Getting those questions, and if the system has already answered them, right? Share those answers more clearly. But a lot of it is, you know, I've talked. I was typing with Emily. Some of the principals I've spoken to are saying, you know, they're getting mandates for, you know, you have to buy a air filter, right? But not any more specific mandates on like what does that air filter need to do, right? What are the good models that we should be buying, right? And we could be serving some kind of role of saying, here are what the other schools, here are what the LEAs are buying, here's what they were satisfied with, what they weren't, right? But I think what people are really afraid of right now at the principal level, from my understanding, just from my conversations with them, is they're given these very abstract guidelines and then given sort of the liability and burden of then potentially choosing the wrong thing to buy as they go through this process, and I'm sensing a lot of fear around that, right? And so this is just one example, right? But if we could collect some of those questions and then be able to shop sort of what is clarify at the for them, from whether that's the Aussie level or the DCPS or the Mayor DME's office level, what is the actual answer to that? And if there isn't one, what are the other states' answers to that? What are the other schools doing to help answer that? I would find would answer an immediate need for right now, right? And I think that could tie into a range of things. It could tie into also highlighting what is already being done and done well that is just not necessarily being communicated with very proactively, right? Which I think hits one of those arms, and I think you know, it also helps to bring us into the conversation with more feedback from our communities and our constituents, right? And I don't know if that's the space that brings you in, and your office, Serena, but if I think about sort of what our assets are and what we can do to move this conversation forward, it's convening, it's publishing, it's getting surveys back from folks, right? And then serving as a connector, right? But that's where I am right now, and but also very open to working on something more specific or something more broad, as we think through sort of what level of analysis we're working at. Yeah.
Thanks, Alistair. As a next step, Fraser, I'm going to come to you next. I do want us to shift to thinking about process. I've been taking notes. What I suggest we do via email is just kind of bullet, like, what are the high level suggestions, and almost get people to tally or vote saying like, yes. I also want to acknowledge that Jessica, I'm sure, has ideas that we haven't been able to hear. So if we can circle back on email to narrow in on this question, I just would name one other thing that I think would be a value add, would elevate what is working, and think across the city. And I shared this idea with Alistair, is that I think what we have on the board is a tremendous resource of instructional knowledge. I think what has happened through the debate around reopening is that teachers, I think, unfairly have been blamed for a lot. And what I know to be true is that teachers need support. Our all teacher survey conveyed that teachers are feeling as though they are not receiving support. And so I say all that to say that our task force could be a beneficial resource for educators across the city, whether charter or DCPS. I just chatted out this Louisiana Believes website or hub. I think it would be amazing if we could elevate, like, what are best practices happening in virtual instruction? What are best practices happening in this hybrid learning? What are teachers doing well here, there, or what have you, and create an inventory of resources, lesson protocols, et cetera, that leaders could use, teachers could use, and that's kind of responsive. I know that that is very narrow in the sense that that would hone in just on educators versus a more broader parental group. But I think that would be a huge value add for our city, because as I understand it, originally the DME's office, the goal was for that office to bring together charter and district schools to share best practices, what's working, and that isn't really happening. And I know there have been attempts in the past. So I just think that's an idea to just put on the table. Fraser, I want to come to you and then make sure we pivot to process.
I got to jump off for today,
Okay.
but then
Thanks,
thanks,
Alistair.
I'll catch you all soon. Yeah, thanks.
I just, I came in when you were saying what is working. I haven't heard anything about what was working. And I
That's
think
what I'm
what you
saying.
just mentioned, what you just mentioned is what we need to find out. Because there is no communication.
Exactly.
There's no cross charter and public school communication. There's no downward communication from the school leaders, quote unquote. And the thing about it is we don't, pardon me, that's my phone is only working when I get a call in. I can't answer it. I don't know. I've got to go to Verizon right after this meeting. Hopefully they'll fix it. But see, the problem that I have is when you say I want to know what is working.
That would be the question this task force. What I'm suggesting as a potential idea was that is what this task force would be working to answer, knowing that teachers are having success. Some teachers are knocking it out of the park. We have to your point, Fraser, there is no inventory of that citywide. And could we create a resource that said, go here to find lessons that are working, family engagement resources that are working, special education services that are proving successful even at a distance. And the list could go on and on and on.
I think the only problem, I agree with that would be really nice to have. But that's not, I mean, like I have a friend who's a teacher and he's a great teacher. And he gets like one class, he's got like 18 kids coming. In his other class, he's got 2 or 3 kids coming. These are high school students, all right? And they're failing. The class, I mean, it's like 20 people in the class and the 2 people coming. You know, that's what's not working. I don't know what it seems to me that the system is set up to fail right now with the way the grading system is, with the way the attendance system is. You can't use attendance as any reason to give a student an F.
Well,
Did you all know that? It's in the guideline. It says it right in the guideline. Attendance has been waived for the 2021 school year. If I'm a student and it's waived, when I went to college, the first week I was in college, the guy told me, and I never missed a day of school in high school. And I was a horrible student, but I never missed a day because I wanted to be with my friends. I wanted to go to high school and be there, all right? The guy told me, Fraser, they don't even take the roll in the class. I stopped going to class when I was a freshman
when you
in college.
say it's waived, Fraser, you mean it doesn't count towards grade. Is that right?
It doesn't count at all. I'll read it to you.
But it doesn't count for.
What?
The school has to collect it. So it counts for the school, but it doesn't count for the student, is what you're saying.
I'm going to read the paragraph, last paragraph on the guideline. Poor course attendance can certainly result in a student not adequately progressing. As such, teachers are expected to monitor student engagement regularly. However, because DCPS has a waiver in place for course level attendance, automatic course failure will not be associated with attendance in this school year. If I'm a student,
yeah,
I mean, it's just that's setting kids up to fail. That's giving them an out. These aren't stupid kids. They understand the whole process.
I mean, I think this is part of the this is part of where state board can actually have some specific comments on, right? Because the attendance policy was waived by council without state board being involved in those discussions, right? And so this is part of that discussion that like there are consequences to doing things the way that council did them, and this is one of them, right? That there are interpretations that say that attendance can't be used to penalize, which I think on its face seems like a good idea, right? Like we don't want to penalize students who are unable to attend because of technological issues or because of whatever. But I think some of the ways that it's being implemented may not be that same type of thing. And I think that's the point you're trying to make, right, Fraser?
Yeah.
That it's you know, the interpretation is not necessarily what I think people think it may be. But I'm not sure that gets us to something that we can actually do effectively by the termination date of this task force. And I think that's the other piece that we need to go back to what Zachary was saying at the beginning is putting in the guardrails and understanding exactly what we're going to look at fairly quickly so that we can get started.
And we're talking about doing that before the end of the school year, right?
I think I think it said June, wasn't it, Zachary? Or was it August?
I believe it's August, but yes, it's August. And Serena, I'm trying to Google and find the 6 points, but in the notes, I did put what I heard at the Ward 5 meeting from the deputy mayor. He kind of bucketed those focus areas into 3 groups, this response phase, recovery phase, and reimagining phase. Some of the things anecdotally, there are 6 points. One is around virtual instruction. One is around continuous learning through summer, leaning on parks and recreation, the Marion Barry Youth Leadership. Another is around family engagement and family education. He cited like the DCPS Parent University as one. Those are 3 that come to mind, but I will find it. Or is this it, Emily? You're on mute.
This is something different. This is actually, I was looking for that in the DME Ed site thing entries, but I found something on attendance that I thought, I mean, this is from the summer, but might be relevant to this conversation. Just an FYI. But
if I remember right, I think it may have actually been the DME's testimony at the learning loss hearing.
That's what it was. So it may not be written anywhere else.
No,
if you want to look at that testimony, that was.
I'll find it. I emailed the group to give them a heads up before Paul came and spoke to us, if you remember. And I said, oh, he's going to highlight this framework, and here are the 6 areas that he named. So, but I do, just being mindful of time, want to think about process. So it is now March. We have until August. And I will say, if need be, I think there is some flexibility with that timeline. We can go back to the board and say, hey, we need to convene for an extra month or 2. But assuming that is our current timeline now, between now and August, what seems to be an appropriate process for assembling a task force with external members and producing a final report? Let's use those as our 2 benchmarks. Assembling the task force with external members, we can start there. What would need, and I'm just capturing notes if you all haven't been following along, but with that, John Paul, it would seem to me we would need to come up with an application, release that application, review the applications, and then select. Those are like the 4 steps of external. So come up with, create an application, advertise said application, review the application, and then announce the members.
How long, what's your time frame?
Well, that's what we're trying to determine. We have between now and August for our work. So my initial thinking is that we would want to release that application and have it completed certainly by the end of April, so that we could hit the ground running at least in May, which would give us May, June, July, August, 4 months to execute some type of work?
Oh, I think it needs to be quicker than that, Zach. If we're gonna do something, I don't know if we should, I'm sorry. I don't know what the hell's going on. But if we're gonna do something that's gonna have any kind of resonance before summertime, because that's when the rubber hits the road as far as reopening.
Yeah.
And we don't want to have like, well, we've decided on the committee and it's July.
Fair point.
I don't know what the committee, see, I don't know. I didn't even know that you were talking about, I thought we were the committee. But I didn't know that we were going to advertise for other people. I think that's, to me, that's cumbersome.
I think it depends on, Serena, jump in, but I think it depends on what we're trying to answer.
I think having representation from other government agencies, especially ones who are struggle themselves to come up with a plan, could actually like give more credibility to whatever plan is developed and comes out of the task force led by the SBOE. So I do think it would be worthwhile to make space for sort of enhanced membership on the task force team. I do want to note Emily's comment about we need a clear focus first, because I do think that's important too. And I also agree with Fraser's comment that we probably do need to probably have everything like, I mean, as soon as possible, putting out an application for people to join and become members, to get everything out before the school year ends, if that's possible.
Yes.
But I do also want to, again, kind of highlight, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
I was agreeing with you.
Can I ask if it's possible to speed up the process to just make it less formal, the invite? So it's more an invitation than an application?
I mean, I think one of the things that we have found in terms of application in the past is it gets us a more representative group than just selecting people who we may or may not know are, sort of what their opinions are going to be before we add them to the group. And if we do a selected type process, and it is just picking people who we think are going to provide a particular kind of information, then do we really need to add them in the first place?
Mm.
So if we, again, I'm on page 2 of our notes. I've just jotted down, let's backwards map. So what I'm hearing Fraser say is August may be too late. So what do we think is a realistic, and thank you, John Paul. He found those bullets, Serena. He put them in the chat. Thank you. And if I recall, there are only 5 listed here because Paul at the time couldn't remember what the 6th one was, but you still get a sense of what those bullets were from our conversation. So if August is too late, what seems to be a reasonable time frame? I would suggest let's just backwards map from there. And this is just a kind of brainstorm on timeline.
Middle of April.
That we would come up with something by a final product by middle of April.
No. I'm talking about having a committee by the middle of April.
No. So let's start at the end. So we will produce a final product, whether that's a survey, whether those are recommendations, a resource, whatever, by, I'm hearing Emily say June. Does that seem reasonable? Okay.
Middle of June.
Middle of June. So I'm going to put June 15th as our final product date. If that were the case, we would need to meet and convene as a task force, a committee, whatever the structure is, at least 3 months. So that's May, April, and then that puts us in March. So at least we would need to convene at least by mid-April, I would say, right? That would give us 2 solid months to do something.
Yep.
We would say.
How big is the committee?
That's for us to decide. And I will say, I think having external voices is going to be important depending on what we decide to focus on. If we find that we don't need external folk, I think we can probably move faster. And then it's more of a committee than a task force. But as Serena was saying earlier, I think part of the value add of having a task force is that you're able to assemble and convene diverse voices.
Can I just push back a little bit?
Do you mind just holding on that 1 sec? So we have June 15th. Our first meeting would need to be April 15th. We are now at March 8th. So that would give us 1 month of a runway to solicit external members and select them and announce them. Does that seem doable?
I have no idea.
John Paul, does
Serena,
that
what do you think?
I think this is definitely a John Paul question. Sorry to put you on the.
No, you're right.
I mean, I think it's potentially doable. I think the problem that we have, though, is that the commitment in the Dear Colleague letter was that task forces and committees will report to the board in April to decide to make sure that the timing was aligned on all of our committees and task forces. So if this group is going to go do things prior to having that conversation, that seems to be a separation of this committee's role and authority beyond what the rest of the committees have. So I just want to be clear on like what is the appropriate step. I think if this group can give me the sort of marching orders of we want to have X number of people in this task force from these groups, we can do an application pretty easily in terms of setting it up on Google and doing all the forms and that type of thing, because we can reuse kind of some of the ones that we did before. What I would need is just commitment from the task force members to be available to do the evaluation of the applications that we receive and making those selections on a rapid basis, right? If we end up getting, we got almost 100, I think, applications for the social studies standards task force. So if we're talking about doing something which is large, I think we should anticipate having somewhere between at least 50 and 75 applications. But if we do it on a point to you type basis, then we just need to identify who they are and get invitations out. I don't know that that's helpful.
Is the Mayor's Reopen Committee still viable?
I don't know that it's still meeting.
Why?
Wait, what reopening committee? Sorry.
The Mayor's Reopen Committee, the one we didn't get invited to.
Oh yeah.
no, that ended.
You think they did it?
They produced a public report. So yeah, they're finished.
So we wouldn't be stepping on anybody's toes.
No, we would not. And what we've heard from the DME and OSCE is, depending on our focus, they would want to collaborate with us, which I think potentially could be a good thing. So on page 2, I just took a stab at.
What are you talking about?
On page 2 of our agenda document, Fraser.
Oh, I don't know where that
I took a stab at timeline. Here, let me see if I can drop these in the chat. I don't know if you can see this. Does this seem like a realistic timeline? We are now on March 8th. We as a committee or group would need to figure out what is the question, our focus by the 15th, which is by Monday. It seems like John Paul is saying there's already stock template applications available. And so we would need to have that ready to go by Monday as well. If we, after identifying the focus, release the application on the 17th, we would give folk a week to apply. And then, to apply, we would review in rapid order and announce by the end of March for that mid of April first meeting that you said, or final product by mid of June, which we said seems like a doable outcome. To me, given that this is such a tight timeline, I think our question or focus should be very narrow.
Okay, do you have a paragraph or two describing what they're applying for? To
Well,
do what?
by what? Not yet. We would hopefully by March 15th, Monday. And so as a next step, if this timeline feels doable for you all, what I'll do today is to send out summarized suggestions, also asking Jessica to weigh in around what could be our potential focus for a group, ask people to weigh in by end of this week so that hopefully, and we can engage in conversation via email, but hopefully then by Monday, we can say we are going to focus on X as a task force.
Yeah, I agree. I think by Friday.
Yeah, that seems to be the biggest hurdle now, just figuring out what our focus is going to be. Serena, I know you've kind of.
Sorry, I apologize. I do want to note specifically that if this is going to be the way forward, I think you need to inform the board
Yes.
that this is different from what was proposed.
Yes, that I'm happy to do as a point of information. And the framing there is members of this task force are feeling pretty urgent to get a final product in response to blank out ahead of summer, which seems pretty reasonable. And therefore, we are feeling like we need to shift things up a month. And I think people should be able to understand that.
I think you also should ask for input by Wednesday.
From other board members, not on the, yep, I think that's a good idea. Serena, can you just, from your seat.
I've got to go, Zach.
Okay, thanks, Fraser. From your seat,
Thank you
Serena,
all.
what are questions either, I don't want to say that you or your office has, but like, what is a question you think is a huge value add for DC? And you, like that RTI MTSS, I'm not even sure what that is. That was really helpful to hear you frame that. Like, are there other suggestions of what you think might be value additive?
So I think that the sort of big question is that equity piece that I feel like we talk about, but we don't ever really fully address. And I think that is also true in the special education space and English language, like all across the board. I will say on the special ed audit question that you brought up, I know that there's a thought, because we all know, like, right, like students are not getting the scope of services that are in their IEP. And I think that the response from, OSSE and like other education leaders has really been like, look, like this is a case-by-case basis, which is true. It has to be a case-by-case basis. And it's typically something that comes up when we're talking about compensatory education, which compensatory education in and of itself is a legal issue. Like it is, however, we use it in common language all the time, right? Like before we get to litigation. So sometimes what a school will do is they look at the IEP, they look at the service log, and they see that there's been this huge disconnect. But, well, I shouldn't say huge, but a student didn't get all their hours. So they'll still use the language on how we're going to make up for that in the comp ed, am I frozen? Can you still hear me? Okay. But they still use,
frozen, but we can hear you.
Okay, but they're still using the terminology of comp ed, right? What I am concerned about when students go back to particularly for our students with disabilities, when they go back to in-person learning, is how are we going to assess whether the learning loss that they experienced was due to not getting their services, the full extent of their services, or was it sort of this not being prepared for virtual learning in general, right? So there's an extent of like, are we going to compare the student's regression to the other students in the class? Or are we going to compare the student's regression and try to put them back into the place they would have been had they actually received the full scope of their services that they were entitled to? Do you understand the difference in those two analyses?
Yes.
I mean, no. Okay. If you don't, right? Like, so, and I think that is a question that I still don't, I don't know. And I think in the context and the language on the comp ed side, so if a parent does go the litigation route and they maybe file a state complaint or go to the Office of Dispute Resolution, yeah, I think that they might be looking at comp ed in terms of restoring the student to where they otherwise would have been. But a lot of families that we work with don't want to litigate. They don't have an attorney. The system hasn't been fair to them. They don't believe in the system. So does that mean then that the students who are not going through litigation, or those families who are not prepared or not wanting to sort of do that, that those students wouldn't be made whole, because relatively speaking, the regression that they experienced wasn't that much more significant than the regression of their peers. Fundamentally, go ahead.
I'm sorry. What is that question then? What would we then be examining? Because to me, that seems pretty damn persuasive or important as a focus. I know it may just be.
I mean, I think the question is, particularly for students with disabilities, how do we measure regression, and how do we determine whether the services that were provided were reasonable under the light of the circumstances? But that feels like a legal inquiry. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how you're gonna, I don't have the answer to that question, and I don't know that we could do a survey that's going to give us the answer. And so, yeah. But
no, that's super helpful, and it does seem to start getting into the legality of things, which I know Asia probably want to stay clear of.
Right. What some of the things that I do think ultimately are going to be helpful are those questions around, what are you going to do that's different in a Title I school versus, like, our schools that are generally adequately funding? What is that intervention actually going to look like? And the answer should not be the same. Like, hands down, it should not be the same. I do think, like, I'm trying to think, like, I'm sort of like I'm processing all of this out loud. But as we sort of think about, like, what are the areas that that OSSE has been, like, kind of working on and sort of trying to fix, like, we know they're doing some work on literacy and they're going to come up with a plan on that end. Like, how do we connect some of that work with the reopening plan, and with a reopening plan and a reopening strategy that would ultimately, hopefully, improve outcomes for more students, right? So I know, like, maybe a part of OSSE's plan is to provide the tutoring instruction, right? Then for the parent engagement piece, that parent engagement piece, like, what parts of that could be something that we are teaching parents how to support their kids at home, because I do think that that's been an important piece that has been missed and sort of undervalued. And I think that's also connected to special education as well. Like, one of the things that AJE and Children's Law Center has been advocating for is to connect the related services, to provide related service training to the parents so that they can do that with the kids at home. But I think that you all came up with some good ideas at the beginning of this call. And as you were sort of framing what you wanted in terms of a reopening plan, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. And what I heard was this identifying what are the problems. And I want to separate, this is like, who's your target audience? Is it problems for the parents and the families, or the parents for the or the problems for the teachers and the administration? And because you flagged both groups. So identifying the problems, developing those creative solutions, but also doing a needs assessment, and potentially within there highlighting what's working well. I think it's possible, if you were to take an approach similar to Mendo's staff, like, and ask some of those, like, those questions, like, that you could get some of that like a lot of that information, and then use that as your foundation to frame that into a plan. I don't, on this piece on like with OSSE and the DME, I think it would be interesting to learn, like, what is the emphasis that they would be looking for in order to be interested in participating?
Yeah.
Like, what is it? What are you looking for?
These 5 things I can imagine a world. Now, I don't think our goal should just be come play with us, Asi or DME. But
Sure.
if these 5 things highlighted in the chat, somehow we were to solicit more information from the public or schools, I could see them really being interested in that. And so, for instance, continuing to support teachers to improve virtual learning, our value add could be a series of needs assessments or a series of surveys, one to teachers to say, what are the types of support you want and need for virtual learning? And so therefore we produce a report to say, you name these 5 or 6 focus areas, and now we've done more research on the specifics around what you should implement the summer and the fall.
If you're talking about a narrow focus, I do think there's a lot of benefit in reaching out to teachers and administrators of schools and doing that in a way that sort of allows them the opportunity to speak transparently. I know like that Mendel's, I think this was on the call with Mendel, I can't remember at this point, but they had talked about having some administration and teacher representation, but it didn't necessarily seem to be as extensive as it could have been. But if you were to focus on your schools and to get your schools to tell you what it is that they feel like they're missing and what they need, I think that that could help. And your schools can also tell you what they feel like is working well. I think a lot of people are like reaching out or doing the parent type of engagement. So I feel like on that side, it might end up being like redundant.
I like that a lot. Oh, I know we are over time, 3 minutes. If you all could just give 2 more minutes and we're gonna jump. But to that point, I think you're getting somewhere, Serena and Emily. I would love like jump in, please. I'm just appreciating this thought exercise. If we were to say we are going to do a needs assessment for schools and teachers or educators broadly, and perhaps frame it around these things that the DME has already said they're interested in, do you all think that could be a compelling body of work for this task force?
I don't think that we could do all of these issues. I think the continuing to support teachers to improve virtual learning
Could be,
and
but
the family.
broadly examining what's working well, teacher, school leader, and what support and or resources do you need to execute in the summer and the fall? If like that was our charge, and I can imagine a world that task force convenes educators, has conversations, and we end with a report to say, we've talked to thousands of educators and these are the things they say are working well and what they need. Does that seem okay?
I like that. That seems like the most plausible proposal that we've come up with so far in this meeting, like a list of 2 lists basically, right? And that does seem helpful. I think it's helpful also not only to system leaders, but just to kind of put it out for everyone to put it in one place, you know, to sort of see that, oh, this isn't just us who has this issue, but this is like something schools.
And there would need to be some way of safe, transparent conversation where there wasn't like retaliation for folk to be honest. So thank you for this. I will follow up an email, but I think we're getting closer to what that potential focus could be. One last question before we jump, I'm sorry. What do you think is the final product? If we were to take that as our focus, what is working well? What do you need for success moving forward? Is that
you were saying that was the final product, like those 2 lists? I mean, I actually don't know if we could. Yeah, I do think
like a report. Is it a poll? Is it a series of video conversations? I don't know.
I mean, what I was thinking when you said that is like, you know, this is what's working well. Here are some examples. And it's, yeah, so I guess it's a report. And here's where the needs are. And here's some examples of why it's probably, you know, and just going through each of the points that.
Okay.
Can I ask, sorry, go ahead, Serena.
No, you go.
It was actually clarification from you when you were saying, you know, referencing what Mendo's office did, were you talking about like the town halls that he held? So are you suggesting kind of what I was suggesting, which is make it more informal, or are you saying doing that in addition to having a task force? Like gathering information by just going to the community and also having a task force, or one or the other?
Yeah, to me, I think the community piece should happen first. And then like, this kind of gets back to what is the final product. Part of the way I think about it is if you have the conversations with teachers and administrators and you like sort of bucket the issues, and then maybe the task force is coming together to resolve some of those issues and strategize. And at that point, like, I don't know, like, I don't know how large the task force have been in the past, but this, I mean, to some extent, it could be if you had some kind of representation from a few various groups, and then also, and then looped in like Aussie and the DME on some of the issues that you see, like they can kind of say, similar to how we do with our annual report, look, this is something we think we can do, we can like fix, and let's talk about that, right? Like, and sort of take that approach. I do not think that you have time to do like a full extended like task force in the way that I've seen kind of done and like and produced in the past. I don't see how anybody has time for that.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you all. We are gonna jump. You will get an email from me today, and we're gonna move kind of rapid fire based on our accelerated timeline. And so we will align on a decision ideally by Friday, but no later than Monday. And then John Paul and I will work in terms of scheduling upcoming meetings. Serena, I hope you can join, even if you're gonna just be a participant, because your voice here has been really helpful for me at least. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye. Happy
Bye.
performance oversight hearing season. Bye.
I guess.
Bye.